Hi, Steel Point community. Welcome to another seminar of the monthly series in critical psychology, hosted by Steel Point. My name is Maria Laguna. I'm a psychotherapist based in New York City, and today we will be talking about spirituality and psychology. Are they friends? Are they foes? In which ways we therapists can identify a client's spiritual practices, and how can we integrate that into the treatment? We're also going to discuss the ways in which capitalism has co-opted certain spiritual practices and therefore eliminated its cultural roots. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoy, and as always, feel free to post your comments in the chat section. The definition of spirituality is quite tricky because all the research on the subject has not been able to come up with a universal and comprehensive definition of what spirituality is. So maybe we can start by taking a look at the origin of the word. Spirituality comes from the Latin word spiritus, which means breath of life. Every time we talk about the spirit of something, we're talking about its most essential part. But still, this is not enough to understand what spirituality is. So let's take a look at some definitions. An interpersonal and metaphysical relationship with a higher power or transcendent force which provides motivation, purpose, and a sense of connectedness with others. A universal human experience in terms of connectedness or relatedness. A quality that goes beyond religious affiliation, that strives for inspiration, reverence, awe, meaning, and purpose, even in those who do not believe in God. The spiritual dimension tries to be in harmony with the universe, strives for answers about the infinite, and comes essentially into focus in times of emotional stress, physical and mental illness, loss, bereavement, and death. In other words, being spiritual means being connected, being self-aware, and being authentic, but it also means searching for higher values, inner freedom, and things that give life meaning. So, all of this sounds very similar to religion, right? Here are some similarities. Both involve a search for meaning in life, has to do with a specific set of values, involves a search for transcendence, shared values and support, and a relationship with a higher power. But there's also differences. One of these differences is that while spirituality involves the experiential and personal side of our relationship to the transcendent, religion involves organizational structures, practices, and beliefs of a specific religious group. This graphic shows the similarities and differences in a clear way. Spirituality poses questions such as, where do you personally find meaning? How do you feel connected? What your values are? And how should you live? Whereas religion asks questions such as, what practices, rituals should you follow? What's right and wrong? What's true and false? A few things to keep in mind as therapists when addressing spirituality in the consulting room is, first of all, the need for an empathic understanding of the client experience of spirituality, the way they make sense out of it, the ways in which they see the world differently, what it means to them. Also, it's important to create a safe space where the client can feel comfortable and safe enough to address this experience in the consulting room. It is very common that those who have very strong or spiritual or religious experiences that have been minimized or even judged by previous therapists. So it's important to create that atmosphere of safety. Then we also have the need for self-awareness. What are our own spiritual beliefs? What do we believe in? What is our own version of transcendence? What is it that we consider sacred? Do we have our own biases about spirituality? Is there any chance that we may end up pathologizing it or overvaluing it? Finally, rejectionism. We need to be aware that some therapists and some professionals in general do tend to pathologize spirituality, and in fact that has been part of the history of psychoanalysis. So a few things to keep in mind while addressing these things. So how can we clinicians address spirituality with our clients? In therapy, particularly in the West, we're still very much used to having a problem-focused approach. We're very much used to asking clients what went wrong, what kind of traumatic events they had in their lives. But I think we should ask more often what went right. What kind of supports do they have in place? What kind of people did they have in their lives that supported them through difficult times? And also, what kind of spiritual beliefs kept them going? In this way, whenever we're addressing spirituality, we're also communicating to the client that we're interested in their resilience, in their thoughts and beliefs that keep them going through difficult times. What does critical psychology have to say about spirituality? Critical psychology invites us to step back and look at how mainstream psychology produces knowledge and what practices are praised and which ones are marginalized. By providing us with this critical thinking tool, critical psychology can help us reflect on how spirituality is perceived and modified in Western culture. One of the tools that critical psychology offers us is understanding the ideological implications of the practices that we engage in our daily lives. For example, critical psychology can help us reflect on the ideologies underlying spirituality in the Western world. There's a lot of instances in which modern-day versions of spirituality emphasize the private, interior aspect of spirituality, which is very different from its roots. Western healing practices have historically fragmented the individual into separate parts. On the other hand, in spiritual traditions such as Buddhism, health is considered a harmonious balance between our minds, our body, our emotions, and our spirit, and that it's lived out in our interpersonal relationships. All of these domains are interdependent instead of being fragmented, as happens mostly in Western cultures. Another aspect of spirituality that tends to be neglected in Western culture is the one of indigenous spirituality. The spiritual practices of indigenous people have been historically suppressed by colonialism. This book has a great account of how much indigenous culture and spirituality were lost and had to be recovered. According to this book, some of the characteristics of spirituality is that spirituality is considered to be the foundation of all aspects of education. It is through spirituality that people maintain healthy relationships with the land, the natural environment, and other indigenous groups. Critical psychology helps us examine the dominant readings of spirituality in the Western societies, one that can be quite different from the roots of certain spiritual practices and beliefs. Many authors claim that contemporary spirituality in the West has been appropriated by corporations to promote efficiency and extend markets in a fast-moving information economy. Workplace spirituality attempts to bring commitment, job satisfaction, and positive employee work attitudes. In the book Selling Spirituality, for example, its author alerts us how spirituality in the workplace involves a silent takeover of spirituality by contemporary ideologies such as neoliberalism. When spirituality is co-opted by neoliberal ideologies, spiritual teachings become commodified. Neoliberalism has the potential to promote self-interest, personal development, and radical individualism instead of fostering collective values, which is at the core of spirituality. Another problem with the neoliberal framing of spirituality is that if human suffering is thought of as something spiritual and not also economic or political, this can create a tendency for people to believe that their problems exist only in their minds and it only depends on themselves to be fixed. There are many benefits to spirituality. Some studies show that it has the potential to reduce cognitive decline later in life. Other studies show that it can reduce cardiovascular disease and that patients receiving treatment for addictions report better ability to cope. Additionally, spirituality can be a source of social support, and it can help us relate differently with our sense of time. Every time we set time apart from our daily lives, we can learn a lot about ourselves through meditation or other spiritual practices. Can spirituality be a problematic or unhealthy way of coping? In this 3-minute YouTube video, Dr. Gabor Mate explained this a little bit better. Here's a little segment of the video.
Seeking, as long as it's in the service of truth, is great. If it's in the service of certainty, it can be a limitation. So people can use that truth seeking both to deepen their relationship to reality or to actually limit their relationship to reality. And I think it's a California-based Buddhist teacher, psychologist John Wellwood, who talks about what he calls a spiritual bypass. And I've seen a lot of people using a spiritual bypass to get away from themselves.
The term spiritual bypass was coined by the psychologist John Wellwood in 1984. Spiritual bypass happens when we use spiritual ideas and practices to avoid unresolved emotions. We engage in spiritual bypass whenever we attempt to heal psychological wounds only at the spiritual level and avoid working through the issue at other levels such as cognitive, physical, or emotional. Spiritual bypass operates by avoidance and suppression of painful thoughts or feelings. So what does it look like in a clinical work? In some cases, spiritual bypass can look like perfectionism, avoidance of painful thoughts and emotions during session, apprehensions about intimacy, and fear of personal responsibility. In order to welcome spirituality in the consulting room, it's advisable that we first take a look at our own sense of spirituality and what's involved. This book has great recommendations on some questions to assess client spirituality and our own. Do you see yourself as a religious or spiritual person? Are you affiliated with a religious or spiritual denomination or community? If so, which one? Has your problem affected you religiously or spiritually? Has your religion or spirituality been involved in the way you have coped with your problem? If so, in what way? From what sources do you draw the strength and courage to go on? Where do you find peace? Who truly understands your situation? When you're afraid or in pain, how do you find comfort and solace? What sustains you in the midst of your troubles? What are the deepest questions that your situation has raised for you? How has this experience changed you at your deepest levels? What have you discovered about yourself that you find most disturbing? How has this situation shaken your faith? What would you like to be able to let go of in your life? Back to your original question. Psychotherapy and spirituality, friends or foes? This is a false dichotomy. Spirituality is an inescapable aspect of our lives, whether we recognize it or not. We all have things that we consider sacred, and the fabric of our very existence depends on our connectedness with ourselves or others. All of this is inherently spiritual. Bringing this aspect into the therapy office is not only beneficial, but necessary. What is also necessary, and here is where critical psychology comes in handy, is in identifying the uses and misuses of our relationship with the spiritual.